The first thing people noticed wasn't how quietly the old woman sat in first class. It was that she sat there at all. She was already settled when most passengers boarded. Her small frame upright, hands folded neatly over a cracked brown leather handbag that looked older than the plane itself. The seat around her gleamed with polished luxury. Cream leather, brushed metal screens glowing softly. But she didn't touch any of it. She didn't recline. She didn't explore the controls. She simply sat, calm, still, as if she were afraid that moving too much might draw attention she didn't want. And it worked at first. Then the whispers started. A man across the aisle leaned toward his wife and murmured, "Are we sure she's supposed to be here?" Another passenger glanced openly at her shoes, clean but worn thin at the soles, and then at the glass of champagne in his own hand. His mouth tightened. "She probably wandered in," someone muttered from 2 rows back, not bothering to lower their voice. The old woman heard everything. Her hearing wasn't what it used to be, but shame had a way of traveling clearly through the air. Still, she didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead, eyes resting on nothing in particular, breathing slow, steady, practiced. She had learned a long time ago how to make herself small when the world decided she didn't belong. A flight attendant stopped beside her seat. The attendant was young, professionally polished, her smile crisp and rehearsed. At first, her voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "Ma'am," she said quietly, bending slightly, "I think there may have been a mistake with your seat." The old woman turned her head slowly. Her face was lined deeply, but her eyes were clear, alert. "There's no mistake," she replied, her voice soft but steady. The attendant's smile faltered just a little. "If I could see your boarding pass, please." Without hurry, the woman opened her handbag. It took her a moment. Her fingers were stiff, uncooperative. But finally she produced a folded paper boarding pass and handed it over with both hands. The attendant scanned it. Once, twice. Her eyebrows drew together. First class. Seat confirmed. Name verified. The pass was valid. The attendant felt heat rise in her cheeks. Not embarrassment, but confusion. She glanced at the woman again, really looked this time, and then looked back down at the boarding pass as if it might change its mind. "Well," she said carefully, "please give me just a moment." She walked away. The whispers grew louder. "She doesn't look like first class," a man said plainly, his voice edged with annoyance. "I paid good money for this seat," another added. "This is ridiculous." The old woman clasped her handbag tighter. Her knuckles turned pale. She told herself she had done nothing wrong. She told herself she belonged here because she had paid for the ticket, because she had followed every rule, because she had waited years for this moment. Still, her heart thudded painfully in her chest. The flight attendant returned, this time with a second crew member. They spoke in hushed tones just out of earshot, glancing toward the cockpit, then back at the old woman. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," the attendant said again, louder now, more formal. "There seems to be a verification issue. We just need to clear something up." "What kind of issue?" the woman asked. The attendant hesitated. "Just a routine check." The word routine didn't fool anyone. A phone appeared, then another. Screens lifted subtly, then openly. Someone in the aisle began recording without shame. Moments later, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. The mood shifted instantly. They were taller, broader, their presence heavy. They didn't smile. One of them looked directly at the old woman and spoke in a voice meant to carry. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step off the aircraft." The cabin fell quiet, not with respect, but anticipation. The old woman felt the weight of every eye on her. Heat crept up her neck. Her chest tightened. She looked down at her hands, then back up at the officer. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "There's an issue with your seating," he replied. "We'll resolve it outside." Her lips pressed together. For a moment it looked as though she might argue. But instead, she reached again into her handbag and produced the boarding pass, holding it up with a slight tremor. "It says first class," she said gently. "I checked twice." The officer barely glanced at it. "We'll sort that out. Please stand up." A man near the window scoffed. "Finally." Another passenger shook his head and muttered, "First class isn't charity." The words hit harder than any hand ever could. The old woman closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they glistened, but no tears fell. "May I ask something?" she said. Her voice so quiet the officer had to lean closer. He sighed. "Make it quick." "May I finish this flight?" she asked. "I've waited a very long time." The sentence landed in the silence like a dropped glass. For just a second, something flickered across the officer's face. Then it vanished. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "You need to come with us." The old woman nodded. Slowly, carefully, she rose from her seat. Her knees protested. Her balance wavered. No one moved to help her. As she stepped into the aisle, humiliation burning hotter than fear, she thought, not for the first time, that perhaps she had been foolish to believe she still deserved nice things. And then, just as she took her first step forward, the cockpit door opened. The cockpit door opened with a soft mechanical click, a sound so ordinary it should have gone unnoticed. But in that charged silence it felt thunderous. A man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a crisp pilot's uniform that fit him like it had been tailored to his spine. His hair was neatly trimmed, dark with strands of gray at the temples. His posture was calm, practiced, the kind of calm that comes from thousands of hours in the air and years of command. Captain Daniel Reeves had stepped out to check a minor delay notification. He had not expected to see airport security standing in the aisle. He had not expected to see passengers filming. And he certainly had not expected to feel his breath catch painfully in his chest. Because there, standing unsteadily between two officers, was a woman whose face he knew better than his own reflection. For a moment the world tilted. Not confusion, recognition. His eyes locked onto hers. The old woman looked up, startled by the sudden stillness, by the way the pilot had frozen as if struck. Their eyes met, and something shifted in her expression. Not recognition, not yet, just uncertainty, edged with embarrassment. Captain Reeves removed his cap without realizing he'd done it. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his voice no longer carrying command, only disbelief. "Is your name Evelyn Carter?" A murmur rippled through the cabin. The officers turned to look at him. The old woman swallowed. "Yes," she replied. Her voice was barely audible. Captain Reeves inhaled sharply. His chest tightened. His vision blurred at the edges. "You," he whispered, and then louder, with a break he could not hide. "You saved my life." The cabin exploded into noise. "What? Did he just?" "No way." The security officers stiffened. One of them frowned. "Captain, we're handling a seating issue." "Step back," Reeves said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority radiated from him, cold and unmistakable. The officers hesitated, then obeyed. Evelyn's hands shook. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, panic creeping into her tone. "If I've done something wrong, I didn't mean." "No," Reeves said, stepping closer. "No, you've done nothing wrong. You never did." He stared at her as if afraid she might vanish. "It's you," he said again, softer now. "I never thought I'd see you again." Passengers leaned forward in their seats. Phones tilted to capture every second. The humiliation that had filled the cabin moments earlier began to dissolve, replaced by confusion, curiosity, and something like unease. Reeves turned toward the nearest flight attendant. "Close the cockpit door," he said, "and pause boarding." "Captain?" she asked. "Now." She obeyed immediately. Reeves turned back to Evelyn. His eyes searched her face, tracing the lines time had carved there. The kindness in her eyes hadn't changed. That same steady calm, the same quiet strength. "You don't remember me," he said gently. She studied him, brow furrowing. "I'm afraid I meet many faces," she said. "I worked in hospitals for a long time." A lump formed in his throat. "Yes," he said. "I know." He glanced around at the cabin, at the cameras, the staring eyes, the open mouths. "This isn't the place," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Then, louder, Everyone, please remain seated. One man scoffed nervously. Is the flight delayed because of this? Reeves' gaze snapped toward him. This flight, Reeves said evenly, is delayed because someone here forgot how to treat another human being. The man shrank back. Reeves turned to the security officers again. She's not leaving this aircraft. Captain, one officer said, choosing his words carefully. Protocol. Protocol is built on respect, Reeves replied. And you failed it. The officers exchanged a look, then stepped back fully, retreating down the aisle. Evelyn's knees buckled slightly. Reeves caught her arm instinctively. I've got you, he said. Her eyes widened at the contact. I'm all right, she insisted, though her voice trembled. No, he said softly. Let me. He guided her back toward her seat, not as a passenger, but as something far more important. As they walked, whispers followed them, different now. That's the captain. She saved his life? Who is she? Reeves helped her sit, then crouched in front of her seat, ignoring the murmurs, ignoring the phones. Evelyn, he said quietly. Do you remember a young man in a burn ward, about 25 years ago? Could barely walk. Thought his life was over. Her lips parted slightly. Her eyes searched his face again, deeper this time. I remember many, she said slowly. But there was one who cried every night. He was angry at the sky. Reeves smiled weakly. That was me. Her breath caught. Oh, she whispered. The memory rushed back with startling clarity. The hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and smoke. The young man with bandaged hands and fury burning brighter than his injuries. You used to say, Reeves continued, his voice thick, if I can't fly again, then none of this matters. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. I told you, she said, her voice shaking now. That fear doesn't get to decide who you become. Reeves nodded. His eyes shone. You wrote it to me, he said, on a scrap of paper. I kept it in my locker for years. Silence swallowed the cabin. For the first time since boarding, no one filmed. Evelyn looked around, suddenly aware of where she was, of the eyes on her. I didn't mean to cause trouble, she said, shrinking inward. I just wanted to go home. Reeves stood. You are home, he said firmly. And this time, no one is going to tell you that you don't belong. Captain Reeves straightened slowly, aware that the entire cabin was holding its breath. He felt the weight of command settle back onto his shoulders, but something softer lived beneath it now. Gratitude, long buried, finally allowed to surface. He turned to the nearest flight attendant. Please bring her some water, he said. Then, after a pause, and a blanket. The attendant nodded quickly, eyes glassy, and hurried away. Evelyn sat stiffly, her hands gripping her handbag, as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. Her heart was pounding. She had not expected this. She had not wanted this. Recognition had never been the reason she did what she did back then. I didn't think you'd remember me, she said quietly. Reeves let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. I remembered you every time I doubted myself, he said. Every time I sat in a cockpit and thought I didn't deserve to be there. He glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at her. May I sit? He asked, gesturing to the empty seat across the aisle. She nodded. As he sat, memories he hadn't allowed himself to touch in years rose uninvited. He was 22 when the training aircraft went down. A mechanical failure during a routine maneuver. Fire. Pain so intense it felt unreal. He remembered screaming. Not from the burns, but from the certainty that his life was over before it had even begun. The hospital room had been dim, machines humming like indifferent witnesses. Doctors spoke in careful tones. Family visited when they could. But it was Evelyn who stayed. She had come in late one night, long after her shift should have ended, carrying a cup of lukewarm coffee and a paperback novel she never actually opened. She sat in the chair beside his bed without asking permission. You don't have to stay, he had snapped at her then, anger sharp and defensive. I'm not dying. I know, she had replied calmly. That's why I'm here. Night after night, she returned. Sometimes she talked. Sometimes she didn't. When he raged, she let him. When he fell silent, she stayed anyway. I don't remember doing anything special, Evelyn said now, shaking her head slightly. I was just there. You were everything, Reeves said. When everyone else saw a broken pilot, you saw a person who hadn't finished yet. Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away stubbornly. Around them, the cabin remained frozen in attention. No one complained. No one spoke. Even the children were silent. One of the security officers stood awkwardly near the exit, his jaw tight. He cleared his throat. "Captain," he said. "Should we?" Reeves turned his head slowly. "You should apologize," he said. The officer stiffened. Then, after a moment, he stepped forward. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice quieter now. "We made assumptions." Evelyn looked up at him. She studied his face. Not with anger, but with the same calm she had shown everyone else. "I hope next time," she said gently. "You won't." He nodded, chastened, and stepped back. The flight attendant returned with water and a blanket, tucking it carefully around Evelyn's shoulders. Evelyn murmured her thanks, embarrassed by the attention. A woman a few rows back wiped her eyes. Another passenger stared down at his phone, shame coloring his expression. The man who had muttered about charity shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Reeves stood again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily now, practiced and steady. "I owe you an explanation." He paused, not for effect, but to steady himself. 25 years ago, I was in a military hospital, certain that my career and my life were over. This woman sat with me when no one else could. She reminded me that fear doesn't get to decide who we become. He looked at Evelyn. I would not be standing here today without her. The silence that followed was heavy, reverent. Then someone began to clap. Softly at first, hesitant. Then another joined. And another. Soon, applause filled the cabin. Not raucous, not celebratory, but sincere. Evelyn's cheeks burned. "Please," she whispered, overwhelmed. "This isn't necessary." Reeves raised a hand, and the clapping faded. "It is," he said gently. "It's overdue." He turned back to the flight attendant. "Please ensure Mrs. Carter has anything she needs." "Yes, Captain." He hesitated, then added, "And I'd like to make an announcement." Moments later, his voice came over the intercom, calmer now, but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Today's flight will be departing shortly. Before we do, I'd like to dedicate this journey to someone who once carried me when I couldn't stand on my own." Evelyn closed her eyes. She felt something inside her loosen, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight for decades. As Reeves returned to the cockpit, she sat quietly, the plane slowly resuming its rhythms around her. Boarding completed. Doors closed. Engines humming. A young flight attendant knelt beside her seat. "Can I get you anything else, Mrs. Carter?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Just, thank you." The attendant squeezed her hand gently before standing. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Evelyn stared out the window, memories playing like old film reels behind her eyes. She thought of the nights she'd sat by hospital beds, the faces she'd never see again, the lives she'd touched without knowing where they would go. She had never expected to be remembered. She had never needed to be. But as the aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky, she felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Not pride, peace. The plane leveled off above the clouds, sunlight spilling through the oval windows like something holy. The cabin settled into a hush broken only by the soft clink of service carts and the low, steady hum of the engines. Yet for Evelyn, the noise felt distant, muffled by the weight of memories that had returned with startling force. She watched the clouds drift past, white and endless, and thought of another ceiling low, stained, flickering with hospital light. Back then, she had been younger, stronger in the body, though already tired in ways no one noticed. She volunteered because it felt necessary, because the ward was always short-staffed, because people slipped through the cracks when no one stayed past visiting hours. Daniel had been one of those people. He had scared her at first, not because he was cruel, but because he was drowning. Anger radiated from him, sharp and desperate. When she had tried to adjust his blanket that first night, he had snapped, "Don't touch me." She remembered stepping back, nodding once, and saying, "All right, I'll just sit." And she had. Night after night she had returned. Sometimes he talked. Sometimes he stared at the wall. Sometimes he shook so badly from pain and frustration that she had reached out without thinking, placing her hand over his bandaged one. "I don't know who I am if I can't fly," he had whispered once, voice breaking in the dark. "You'll still be someone," she had replied. "Flying isn't the only way to exist. But it's the only way I know how to live," he had said. She had stayed silent then, because sometimes silence was the kindest answer. Now, decades later, Evelyn shifted in her seat as a flight attendant gently placed a warm meal on her tray. She stared at it, unsure. She hadn't eaten properly since morning. Her appetite had fled with her dignity back on the ground. "Please," the attendant said softly. "It's on us." Evelyn nodded, murmuring thanks, though her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her fork. Across the aisle, a woman leaned toward her husband, her voice thick with regret. "I shouldn't have assumed," she whispered. "I feel awful." Her husband nodded, eyes fixed forward. "So do I." Further back, the man who had muttered about charity stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. His face burned, not with anger now, but with the quiet shame of being seen by himself. In the cockpit, Captain Reeves sat back in his seat, hands steady on the controls, eyes fixed on the horizon. His co-pilot glanced at him, concern etched into his face. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Reeves exhaled slowly. "I didn't expect today to happen like this." "No one ever does," the co-pilot said. Reeves nodded. "She taught me something I forgot," he said. "That people carry histories we never bother to imagine." The co-pilot was silent for a moment. "You handled it well." "I didn't," Reeves replied. "I should have handled it sooner. She shouldn't have had to stand in that aisle at all." The words stayed with him as the flight continued. Midway through the journey, light turbulence rippled through the cabin. The seatbelt sign chimed softly. A child whimpered, startled. Instinctively, Evelyn reached across the aisle and rested her hand over the child's, offering a gentle squeeze. "It's all right," she said. "Planes are stronger than they feel." The child's mother smiled gratefully. "Thank you." Evelyn nodded, then withdrew her hand, settling back into her seat. When the turbulence passed, Reeves' voice came calmly over the intercom, reassuring, steady. The same voice that had once trembled in a hospital bed. Evelyn closed her eyes. She remembered the night Daniel had decided to quit. He had stared at the wall, fists clenched, and said, "They're transferring me tomorrow. I won't be flying again." She had looked at him for a long time before speaking. "Then don't let this moment decide the rest of your life," she had said. He had laughed bitterly. "Easy for you to say." She had reached into her pocket, pulled out a scrap of paper, and written the words slowly, carefully, as if they mattered. "Don't ever let fear decide who you become." She had left the note on his bedside table and walked out before he could argue. She never knew if it worked. Now she did. As the flight began its descent, Reeves stood in the cockpit doorway once more, scanning the cabin until his eyes found Evelyn. She looked smaller now, tired but peaceful, the blanket tucked around her shoulders. He waited. When the wheels touched down and applause rippled through the cabin, a reflex, celebratory, Reeves remained standing. As passengers rose and gathered their belongings, he stepped out fully, positioning himself at the front of the aircraft. He watched as people filed past Evelyn's seat. Some smiled at her. Some nodded. A few murmured apologies they were too embarrassed to make earlier. When Evelyn finally stood, moving slowly, Reeves walked toward her. "May I?" he asked, offering his arm. She hesitated, then nodded, resting her hand lightly on his sleeve. Together, They walked toward the exit. At the door, Reeves stopped. He knelt, right there in front of everyone. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Reeves reached into his bag and pulled out a small, simple frame. Inside was a photograph of a young man in uniform, standing beside an aircraft, smiling with cautious pride. On the back, written carefully in ink, were the words, "Because of you, I fly." Reeves held it out to her with both hands. Evelyn stared at it, her breath catching. Her lips trembled. Tears finally spilled, unashamed now. "I didn't do this for this," she whispered. "I know," Reeves said. "That's why it matters." She took the frame, pressing it gently to her chest. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt seen. Not for what she wore, not for where she sat, but for who she had always been. And as she stepped off the plane, head held a little higher than before, the world felt, at last, kind. The terminal air felt different from the cabin. Cooler, louder, filled with echoes of rolling suitcases and distant announcements. Evelyn stepped forward slowly, still clutching the framed photograph as if it might disappear if she loosened her grip. Captain Reeves walked beside her until the flow of passengers forced them to pause near the gate. "This is where I leave you," he said quietly. She looked up at him, eyes still wet. "You have a plane to fly," she replied, almost teasing, though her voice trembled. He smiled. "I always do." They stood there for a moment, neither quite ready to move. Around them, life continued. Families reuniting, business travelers checking phones, children tugging impatiently at parents' sleeves. Yet for Evelyn, time seemed to hover. "I didn't think anyone remembered," she said finally. "You see so many people when you work in hospitals. Faces blur. Names fade." "They didn't," Reeves said. "Not the way you think." She tilted her head, curious. "I've met pilots who never should have been flying," he continued. "And I've met pilots who were only flying because someone believed in them once. You were that someone, for more than just me." Evelyn absorbed that quietly. "I was only doing my job," she said. "No," he replied gently. "You were doing more." A voice crackled over the intercom, calling Reeves back to duty. He straightened reluctantly. "Take care of yourself, Evelyn," he said. She nodded. "You too, Daniel." He hesitated, surprised she remembered his name. Then he smiled, wide, unguarded, and turned away. Evelyn watched him go until he disappeared into the controlled chaos beyond the gate. Only then did she look down at the photograph again. Her fingers traced the edge of the frame, lingering over the handwriting. "Because of you, I fly." She swallowed hard. Her journey wasn't over yet. Another flight waited, shorter, quieter, nothing special. She made her way to the connecting gate, moving with measured patience. This time, no one questioned her presence. No one stared. At the gate, a young agent smiled brightly. "Mrs. Carter? We've been expecting you." Evelyn blinked. "You have?" "Yes, ma'am," the agent said. "Your seat's ready." First class again. Evelyn hesitated. "It's all right," the agent added quickly, reading the uncertainty on her face. "You belong there." The words struck deeper than the agent could possibly know. As Evelyn settled into her seat once more, she reflected on how close she'd come to walking away earlier. Not just from the plane, but from the belief that she still mattered. She had spent her life showing up quietly, leaving quietly, never asking for acknowledgement. That habit didn't vanish easily, but something had shifted. During the flight, a man across the aisle struck up a conversation. "Long day?" he asked kindly. "Yes," Evelyn replied. Then, after a pause, she added, "But a good one." He smiled. "Those are rare." They talked briefly about weather, about travel, about nothing that mattered. Yet the ease of the exchange warmed her. When the plane landed, Evelyn disembarked without incident. No cameras, no whispers, just quiet respect. Outside the terminal, her daughter waited. "Mom!" she called, waving. Evelyn's daughter, Linda, hurried toward her. Concern etched across her face. "You didn't answer your phone." "I was worried." Evelyn smiled softly. "I didn't hear it ring." Linda glanced at the framed photograph tucked under Evelyn's arm. What's that? Evelyn hesitated, then handed it over. Linda studied the picture, then flipped it to read the words on the back. Her eyes widened. Mom, what is this? Evelyn exhaled slowly. It's a long story. They walked toward the parking lot together, Linda listening intently as Evelyn recounted the events, halting at first, then with growing clarity. She spoke of the aisle, the security officers, the pilot stepping out, the recognition. Linda stopped walking. They tried to remove you? Evelyn placed a hand over her daughter's arm. It's all right. It worked out. That's not the point, Linda said, anger flashing. You shouldn't have been treated like that. Evelyn nodded. I know. They resumed walking. As they reached the car, Linda looked at her mother. Really looked. You never told me about that pilot, she said softly. There were many like him, Evelyn replied. I didn't think it mattered. Linda hugged her tightly. It does. You do. Evelyn closed her eyes, resting her cheek against her daughter's shoulder. She felt tired in a way sleep couldn't fix, but lighter, too. That evening, as Evelyn unpacked in the quiet of her guest room, she placed the framed photograph on the bedside table. She stood there for a long moment, staring at it. She thought of all the times she'd doubted herself, all the moments she'd been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. She thought of the aisle, the fear, the humiliation, and then the voice. Ma'am, is your name Evelyn Carter? She sat down slowly on the bed, hands folded once more over her handbag. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel proud. Not loudly, not boastfully, but in the quiet way that lasts. Tomorrow she would visit her granddaughter. She would bake cookies. She would tell stories she'd never told before. Life would continue. But tonight, Evelyn Carter slept knowing something she had never needed, yet deeply deserved to know. She had mattered all along. Sleep came slowly to Evelyn that night. She lay on her side, facing the small framed photograph on the bedside table. The room dim except for the amber glow of a lamp in the hallway. The house was quiet. Too quiet for someone who had spent most of her life surrounded by beeping monitors, murmured prayers, and the soft rasp of struggling breaths. Her mind drifted not forward, but back. She remembered the hospital corridor where Daniel had been wheeled past her one last time. His face pale, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if he were afraid to look at the world again. She had stood there, holding a clipboard, watching him disappear around the corner. She hadn't waved. She hadn't called his name. She had learned early that goodbyes often made things harder. She had never expected to see him again. Evelyn turned onto her back and stared at the ceiling. The humiliation from the plane still flickered at the edges of her thoughts. The way voices had sharpened, the way eyes had judged, the way she had felt herself shrinking, instinctively preparing to accept removal not just from first class, but from dignity itself. What unsettled her most was how familiar that feeling had been. She had known it all her life, being mistaken for less, being overlooked, being tolerated rather than welcomed. Somewhere between youth and old age, she had learned that the world often measured worth by appearance, by confidence, by noise. She had possessed none of those things. Yet somehow, without realizing it, she had shaped lives. That realization stayed with her as morning light crept through the curtains. At breakfast, her granddaughter Emma sat across from her, swinging her legs under the table, eyes bright with curiosity. Mom said you met a pilot, Emma said between bites of toast. A real one, Evelyn smiled. I suppose I did. Did he let you see the cockpit? No, Evelyn said gently. But he let me see something else. Emma frowned. What? That sometimes, Evelyn said after a pause. The good we put into the world comes back to us in ways we don't expect. Emma considered this, then nodded solemnly as if it made perfect sense. Later that day, a knock sounded at the door. Linda answered it, then froze. Mom, she called out slowly. You might want to come see this. Evelyn wiped her hands on a towel and walked into the living room. A courier stood there holding a long, narrow box and a folded letter. Mrs. Evelyn Carter? He asked. Yes, she replied, startled. She signed where indicated, thanked him, and closed the door. With careful fingers, she opened the envelope first. Inside was a single page, handwritten. Evelyn, I don't know if I said enough yesterday. I doubt I ever could. There are moments in life that define us, not because they are loud, but because they are quiet. You were my quiet moment, the one that changed everything. I've spent years flying people to places they want to go. Yesterday, I realized I finally got to bring someone where she deserved to be. Thank you for staying when no one else did. Daniel. Evelyn pressed the letter to her chest. Linda swallowed hard. Mom. What's in the box? Evelyn opened it slowly. Inside was a folded airline uniform jacket, pristine and neatly pressed. On the inside lining, stitched in careful lettering, were the same words she had written decades ago. Don't ever let fear decide who you become. Evelyn sat down heavily, emotion finally overwhelming her. That afternoon, the story spread. Someone had uploaded a video from the plane, cropped, respectful, focused not on humiliation but on recognition. Traveled faster than Evelyn could imagine. Comments poured in from strangers around the world. She reminds me of my grandmother. We judge too quickly. Kindness doesn't expire. Linda tried to show Evelyn the screen. Evelyn waved it away gently. I don't need to see it, she said. I lived it. Days passed. Life returned to its smaller rhythms. Grocery trips. Tea in the afternoon. Emma's laughter echoing down the hallway. But something had changed in Evelyn's posture. She stood a little straighter now. Not because she felt superior, but because she no longer felt invisible. Weeks later, a letter arrived from the airline itself. A formal apology. An invitation. A lifetime pass should she ever wish to fly again. Evelyn folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer. She didn't know if she would use it, but knowing she could, that was enough. On a clear morning months later, Evelyn stood at a small regional airport once more, this time by choice. She wore the same modest coat, the same sensible shoes. Nothing about her appearance had changed, yet everything had. As she boarded, a young flight attendant glanced at her ticket, then looked up with a warm smile. Welcome aboard, Mrs. Carter, she said. Evelyn smiled back. She took her seat. Not because she had to prove anything, not because anyone was watching, but because she belonged there. As the plane lifted into the sky, Evelyn rested her hands over her handbag and closed her eyes. She thought of all the quiet moments that made a life. And somewhere, high above the clouds, a pilot flew steady and sure, carrying with him the gift she had given long ago, still unfolding, still rising. Not because she had asked for it, but because kindness, when remembered, never truly lands. As the screen fades and the noise of the world softens, one truth remains. Kindness doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it shows up quietly, sits beside someone in their worst moment, and waits years to be recognized. If this story reminded you to look twice at the people we're too quick to judge, then it has already done what it was meant to do. And before you go, just a small favor. My mom said I need to reach 1,000 subscribers before January 1st, or she won't let me tell another kindness story again. I don't know why she's so strict, but I really like telling these stories. So if you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. Because you never know. The person you support today might be the reason someone else gets to fly tomorrow.